The chamber was built to hold noise. 14 species, 47 delegates, 6 translation rigs running at full capacity, and still the sound bounced off the curved walls of the galactic conquered chamber like something alive, like something that fed on itself. Arguments in 11 languages, procedural motions, counter-motions, a Vreth legal aid reading from a document so long the room's light had shifted twice since he started. Ambassador Sira Voss sat in the human seat and looked at the ceiling. She had been doing that for 2 hours, not zoning out, not dissociating, watching the ceiling the way a person watches something when looking at anything else would break them in public. Her datapad was on the rail in front of her, face down. She knew what was on it. She had known since 300 that morning when the confirmation came through, when the satellite relay finally punched through the interference and delivered the numbers from Varani's IV, or from what was left of Varani's IV, which was mostly rock and ash, and a mineral deposit that the Vreth Consolidated Commerce Authority had already begun the paperwork to register as theirs. 4.2 million people. Gone in 11 hours. The Vreth consul, his name was Dravith, and he had the particular self-satisfaction of a man who had never once in his life been told no, was still talking. He had been talking for 40 minutes. He had 17 pages of legal framework explaining why what happened to Varani's IV was not what it looked like, and he was going to read all 17 of them, and the conquered moderator was going to let him, because that was how this worked. That was how it had always worked. Voss turned the datapad over. The casualty manifest had loaded at the top. Names, ages, last registered residential coordinates. She had written the request for full confirmation herself, at 300, sitting in her quarters in the dark with her hands folded in her lap, because she had known even then that she would need to see them as people, not as a number, even though the number was the thing that would have to go into the official record. She read 4 names. Then she folded the datapad against her chest, stood up, and waited for Dravith to stop talking. He didn't stop. He was on page 11. She stood anyway. The moderator noticed, raised a cautionary limb. She was supposed to wait. She stood. Eventually the room figured out what was happening and went quiet one section at a time, like lights going off in a building at night, until even Dravith trailed off mid-sentence and looked at her with the expression of a man who did not understand why something small was not behaving like something small. The moderator cleared its translated voice. The delegate from humanity is recognized. Voss set the datapad on the rail, screen down again. She said, "We'll be filing a different kind of response." Then she picked up her jacket from the back of her chair, folded it over her arm, and walked out of the chamber. In the corridor, the noise of the room chased her for about 30 feet and then gave up. Her aide, a young man named Paul, who had been on staff for 8 months and had not yet learned to read her silences, fell into step beside her and tried to hand her the full casualty manifest printout. Hard copy. Everything. 412 pages because 4.2 million names took space. She took it from him without looking at it. Folded it in thirds. Slowly, the way you fold something you intend to keep, tucked it into her jacket pocket over the left side of her chest. Paul waited for her to say something. She didn't say anything. He waited another 30 steps. "Ambassador, the full manifest you haven't." "I have it," she said. He understood, eventually, that she meant something different by that than he did. The transmission from Voss arrived at Earth's Office of Strategic Command at 8:47 local time. One line. No encryption flag because it didn't need one. Anyone who intercepted it and understood what it meant would already be too late to matter. "We'll be filing a different kind of response. Give them an education." Admiral Don Akefer read it twice, set his coffee down, read it once more. He was 63 years old and built like someone had assembled him from material that other people had worn out and discarded, thick through the shoulders, face like a weathered wall, hands that had done things he didn't discuss at dinners. He had survived the Scorch relief operations at 22, the Keth border skirmishes at 37, and 31 years of watching politicians explain to military men why the things they had built were never going to be used. He stood up, walked to the east wall of his office, the wall that looked like a wall. He pressed his thumb to a panel that had not been opened since the year his youngest daughter was born. A small door. Inside, a single switch in the down position, a digital counter reading 0, and an authorization queue showing 847 lines, one for every branch of Earth's government, every surviving colony council, every elder assembly from the post-Scorch reconstruction. 847 signatures required before the counter meant anything. 847 people who had all agreed, 31 years ago, that this moment might come. HFY picked up his desk comm and made the first call. His aide, a woman named Commander Yeva Nuz, who had been on his staff for 6 years and knew him better than she sometimes wanted to, appeared in his doorway while he was still on the phone. She had already seen the VOS transmission. She was holding a tablet. Her face was composed in the particular way that people from Varani's IV heritage composed their faces when they were not going to let you see them. Her brother had been on Varani's IV. HFY met her eyes for a moment, one moment, then he looked back at his desk. She sat down at the secondary console without being asked and started making the second call. The counter changed. *2 of 847. Across the Concord, in a low-lit intelligence office with too many screens and not enough windows, a VRETH analyst named Frev was writing his post-incident assessment. He was thorough, professional, and genuinely good at his job, which meant he had been doing this for 8 years and understood exactly what human civilizations did after events like Varani's IV. They protested, loudly. Sometimes they filed sanctions. Occasionally they recalled ambassadors, which caused diplomatic disruption for 3 to 5 standard years before everyone quietly normalized again. He had seen it 7 times with 6 different species. He typed his conclusion in the calm, measured voice of a man who had seen 7 things, and assumed he understood the universe. Human diplomatic withdrawal noted. Grief response posturing expected. Recommend monitoring standard diplomatic channels for formal protest filing within 30-day window. Military mobilization. None detected at present threshold. Threat assessment. Negligible. He paused, added a confidence rating because his supervisor liked those. 97%. Submitted it. Made himself a drink. On Earth, the counter read 79 of 847, and it had only been 4 hours, and every call HFY made was being answered before the second ring. In the Concord chamber, without its human delegate, the session continued. Dravith finished his 17 pages. The room accepted the document into the formal record. Procedural motions were filed. A Trade Commission subgroup requested a delay for full legal review of the territorial reassertion. They used that phrase, *territorial reassertion, without flinching, because by now it had been said enough times that it had lost whatever shape it was supposed to have. No one mentioned the 412 pages. No one mentioned the names. A Tyrath observer, one of the ancient species, long memory, quiet-natured, sat in the gallery that was technically for press and dignitaries, and occasionally for beings who simply wanted to watch. She had been observing Concord sessions for 60 years. She had a recorder that she rarely turned on because mostly there was nothing worth preserving. She turned it on when Voss walked out. She had not turned it off since. She sat in the gallery with her recorder running and watched the chamber process the death of 4.2 million people into paperwork. And she thought about something one of her teachers had told her 60 years ago, when she was new to this work, when she had asked why certain species were worth watching more carefully than others. Watch the quiet ones, her teacher had said. Loud civilizations spend their energy on noise. Quiet ones spend it on other things. She watched the Vreth delegation, accepting congratulations from 3 allied species on the legal elegance of the territorial reassertion framework. She thought about Vas, walking out of the room with 412 pages folded over her heart. She thought about what other things might mean. On Earth, the counter read 230, one of 847. Outside, in the shipyards that 17 intelligence agencies had logged as agricultural processing stations, the lights were on. They had been on for 31 years. Tonight they were brighter. Civ had been an intelligence analyst for 4 years, and she was good at it. Not brilliant, she would have told you that herself. She didn't have the kind of mind that made massive leaps. What she had was patience and a dislike for loose ends, which was, in her experience, more useful than brilliance about 80% of the time. She read everything. She cross-referenced. She followed threads that other analysts let drop because they seemed to lead nowhere interesting. She had been assigned the human military assessment as a follow-up task, standard post-incident protocol. Someone had to do it. She had an open afternoon. She figured she'd be done by dinner. That was 4 days ago. She hadn't left the office in 4 days. It started normally enough. She pulled the public Concord registry, ship counts, military declarations, all the information species were technically required to disclose. Humans had 340 registered warships. Modest, respectable for a species of their size and territory. Nothing alarming. She cross-referenced with energy signature data from the past decade. Routine. The numbers didn't match. She thought she'd made an error. She ran it again. The numbers still didn't match. She went back further, 20 years, then 30. Then she stopped moving for a while, sitting very still at her desk, because the thing she was looking at did not make sense and also made perfect sense, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she needed a moment. The energy signatures in the outer belt of the human home system, logged 11 years ago as a new agricultural processing expansion, pulled something in the range of 4,000 standard warship-equivalent power units per day. Agricultural processing didn't do that. Nothing agricultural did that. She didn't know what agricultural meant to humans specifically, but she was fairly certain it didn't mean asterisk this. She pulled the station schematics. Public record, filed with the Concord Infrastructure Bureau, approved without review because no one reviewed human infrastructure filings because humans were not interesting. The schematics showed grain storage and soil processing arrays. She looked at the schematics for a while. She looked at the energy signatures for a while. She started pulling everything she could find. By the second day, she had 3 screens running and a handwritten list, actual paper, because it helped her think, that she kept adding to and then folding over so she didn't have to see all of it at once. The Deep Range Weather Array around the human second moon. Power output consistent with a full battle station, logged as meteorological equipment, approved in a Concord administrative session 6 years ago in a block vote, alongside 14 other infrastructure approvals that nobody read. The quiet zone in human deep space, designated as a restricted science reserve. 17 probes had tried to image it over 20 years. All 17 had experienced inexplicable equipment failures. All 17 had been written off as the kind of bad luck that happens in deep space. Civ stared at that one for a long time. Then she pulled the design specs for a deep-range sensor dampening array and compared them to the equipment failure reports. The failures followed a pattern. The pattern had a shape. The shape was a perimeter. A perimeter around something they did not want photographed. She wrote a number on her paper. Looked at it. Wrote it again to make sure she hadn't made a math error. She hadn't. Her supervisor's name was Rhett, and he was the kind of man who had been doing this long enough to be unsurprisable. He had seen species hide weapons, hide fleets, hide entire planetary operations behind creative paperwork. Nothing got past him anymore, or so he thought, which was the exact kind of thinking that made what happened next worse. He came in on the third morning to find Civ still at her desk with 4 screens running, and the paper list now unfolded completely and covering half the work's surface. He asked what she had found. She turned one of the screens toward him. He looked at it for a long time. He pulled up a chair, looked at the other screens. He was quiet for so long that Civ started to wonder if she'd made an error somewhere, if the whole thing was going to collapse under a single correction that she'd missed. Then Rhett said very quietly, "That can't be right." "I've checked it 11 times, Civ said, 12 now." He pointed at a number. "This output per day is consistent with a production facility running at capacity, yes. And this has been running for 31 years. The oldest signature I can find dates to 31 years ago, 4 months after the Scorch recovery was declared officially complete." Rhett leaned back. "What's the Scorch?" he asked, because he was Vreth and the Scorch was a human event, and human events were not the kind of thing that made it into standard briefings. Civ had pulled the historical files on the first day, because she had learned early that you couldn't understand what a species was doing now without understanding what had been done to them. "Solar event," she said, 2 centuries ago. Their home system, partial destabilization, lasted 40 years. During that period, she checked her notes, they lost approximately 60% of their population. Their home planet was largely uninhabitable for 3 generations. They rebuilt from 17 off-world colonies with a combined population of under 200 million. Rhett was quiet. "They lost 60%, he said. "Yes. And 4 months after the recovery was declared." "They started building," Civ said. "Yes." She pulled up the first budget reallocation order. The scan was old, slightly damaged at the edges, and at the bottom was the signature of the provisional administrator who had signed it. A woman who, according to historical records, had been receiving radiation treatment at the time for scorch-related illness, and who had died 11 years later of complications. She had been treating her own burns, and she had signed an order to begin construction of something that Civ now understood was not a shipyard in any normal sense of the word, but was in fact the most sustained, patient, and quietly enormous military buildup in the recorded history of this part of the galaxy. Rhett looked at the signature for a long time. "Why?" he said, "not strategically, not professionally. The way a person says why when they have understood something that they wish they hadn't." Civ sat back. "So they'd never have to survive something like that again," she said. The room was very quiet. On Earth, the counter read 714 of 847. The calls were being answered faster now. Word had moved through the colony networks, through the elder councils, through the people who had been waiting, some of them literally waiting, some of them waiting in the way you wait for something you know is coming but can't name. And now they were signing, one after another, in offices and living rooms and one case on a ship in deep transit, because the delegate had got the call and wasn't willing to wait until docking. The Varani's IV Miners Union representative signed in a break room with 3 colleagues watching. He handed the stylus back to the courier. His hand was steady. It was the only thing about him that was. An elder delegate, 81 years old, gray as winter, who had been 6 years old during the first Vreth territorial incursion, the one where humanity had quietly, diplomatically, permanently walked away, signed in her home office at midnight. Added a handwritten note that wouldn't fit in the digital field. The courier photographed it. It said, "We should have done this then. Don't stop until they understand." The counter climbed. 800, 820, 840. In the Concord Intelligence briefing room, A nervous junior officer presented the latest human military movement data to a room of senior Vreth officials. He had been hoping the data would be cleaner by now. It wasn't. Consul Draveth sat at the head of the table. He was not a man who worried easily. He had built his career on understanding other species' limits, and he understood humans. Small civilization, one diplomatic seat, historically non-confrontational. The Varani's IV operation had been calculated precisely. Enough force to end resistance before it organized. Enough legal cover to make conquered intervention procedurally slow. It had worked exactly as planned. "How many ships?" he asked. The junior officer looked at his tablet. "Current confirmed mobilization is, we believe the count may still be in flux, sir. The sensor relays in that sector are." "Give me what you have." 4,300. Draveth nodded. That was more than he'd expected, actually. A genuine grief response. It would look significant in the conquered record, which was probably the point. Posturing, theater, the kind of military gesture that preceded a negotiation. He respected it. Expensive, coordinated, emotionally coherent. The junior officer did not put his tablet down. Draveth looked at him. "Sir," the officer said, "that's per hour." The room stopped. Not metaphorically. The small movements that rooms always make, the shifting, the breath, the ambient hum of people occupying space, all of it stopped, and the silence that replaced it was not a normal silence but the particular silence of a large number of intelligent beings simultaneously reconsidering everything. Draveth looked at the number on the tablet. He looked at it for a long time. "Per hour," he said. "Yes, sir." "For how long?" The officer checked. "Current confirmed mobilization window is 72 hours and ongoing." Draveth did the math in his head. He did it again, because the first answer could not be right. It was right. He set his hands flat on the table, looked at them, looked at the window where the distant stars were doing nothing alarming yet, just sitting there, just being stars, the way they had always been. "How long have they had those ships?" he asked. He was asking the room, he was asking the air. He wasn't sure he was asking anyone who could answer. Nobody answered. On Earth the counter changed. 846 of 847. Akafar picked up the stylus, looked at the authorization queue one last time, 846 lines of names, people who had decided this moment was necessary, people who had trusted him to know what to do when it came. He signed. 847 of 847. The counter hit its ceiling. The switch went up. Somewhere in a deep space sensor-dampened perimeter that 17 probes had failed to photograph. Lights that had been burning low for 31 years brightened to full power, and engines that had been cycling on standby for so long they had become a kind of permanent weather began, one by one, and then in thousands, to roar. The conquered observation satellite at marker 7 Delta 9 had been running passive monitoring duty for 6 years without incident. It was a simple machine, patient in the way machines are patient, without awareness of patience, just continuous function. It logged contacts, tagged anomalies, transmitted routine reports every 4 hours to a relay station that a junior technician checked on alternating days. Its automated log entry for that morning began ordinarily. 400 hours no contacts, all sectors nominal. 401 drive signatures detected bearing 7 Mark IV, count initiating. 402 count exceeds array calibration ceiling, running diagnostic. 403 diagnostic confirmed nominal, sensor array functioning within rated parameters, count is accurate. 404 sensor array overload log suspended. The satellite's passive array had been rated for 10,000 simultaneous contacts. It had never needed more than 300 before. It would never need to log anything again. Magistrate Torin was eating breakfast when his deputy came in. He knew something was wrong before the door fully opened, because his deputy was a composed man, 12 years in colonial administration, 2 border inspections, 1 evacuation, and the look on his face now was the look of a man who had gone somewhere past composed and come out on the other side into a place with no name. Torin put down his fork. His deputy turned the screen around. On it, the observation window feed from the station's upper deck. Hesk Station, Vreth Border Colony, population 340,000, a routine refueling and trade post that had been operating peacefully for 40 years, had never had anything more exciting than a disputed cargo manifest. The window showed the stars. Or it had shown the stars. What it showed now was something else. The stars were going dark. Not going dark the way a storm goes dark, not all at once. One by one first, and then in clusters, and then the clusters ran together into something continuous, something moving, a line of running lights that started at the upper edge of the viewport and extended to the lower edge, and then kept going past both, kept going past the limits of what the window could show, kept going in both directions into the parts of space the camera couldn't reach. Torin stood up. He stood in front of the screen for 11 minutes. He counted without meaning to. He counted because his brain needed to do something, and counting was small and manageable, and the thing in the screen was neither. The lights kept coming, patient, organized, in formation so precise it looked less like a fleet and more like a structure, like something built, like the kind of geometry that didn't happen by accident. He reached for his comm. Raised Vreth High Command on the first try, which told him they were already awake. Everyone was already awake. "What do I do?" he asked. His voice came out more steady than he expected. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Pray they're just passing through." On the bridge of the flagship Orem Vigil *, Admiral Akafor stood at the forward viewport with his hands behind his back. He had slept 4 hours. He had eaten something he couldn't have named. His uniform was correct in every detail because some habits became structural after enough years and stopped requiring thought. The bridge held 340 people and was quieter than a room that full should have been. Not nervous quiet, not the quiet of people suppressing panic, the quiet of people who understood the weight of what they were doing and had decided that the weight deserved silence. Commander Yeva Nuz stood 2 feet to his left. She had requested this posting, the Orem Vigil specifically, the lead ship specifically, in a 1-line memo that had not offered reasons, and Akafor had approved it without asking for any. Her brother's name had been on page 47 of the manifest. She hadn't told Akafor that. He hadn't asked. He didn't need to. They stood together at the viewport and watched Hesk Station pass on the right, small and lit, and behind them the fleet stretched back into the dark for a distance that couldn't be seen from any single point. You had to look at the tactical display to understand the scale of it, and most of the crew had stopped looking at the tactical display because it was easier to function if you didn't. Akafor's aide approached with a tablet. "Final fleet count confirmed, sir." She paused, which was not like her. 70,247 vessels. She waited. He said, "Log it." She logged it and left, and he went back to watching the stars, and the fleet went on moving, patient and vast and quiet as a thing that has been waiting 31 years to move tends to be. The Concord emergency session had been running for 9 hours. By the time the full scope of the fleet mobilization made it onto the official feed. The chamber was a different kind of noise than it had been 3 days ago. 3 days ago it had been procedural noise, the comfortable noise of people managing a situation they understood. This was not that. This was 14 species in various stages of recalibrating their understanding of a civilization they had all, at some point or another, decided was not worth worrying about. Ambassador Voss had been in her seat for 6 hours. She had a cup of tea. She had not spoken. There was nothing to say yet, and she understood timing the way people understand timing when they have spent 20 years in rooms full of people who confused volume with power. She let them go. She let them exhaust themselves against the news. She watched the feeds on her secondary screen, Hesk Station's window camera, which was still running, still transmitting a view of lights that hadn't stopped coming, and she drank her tea and waited. When the moderator finally restored enough order to formally recognize her, she set the cup down. "We are not at war with the Vreth," she said. Her voice was the same temperature it always was. "We are delivering a formal response to the destruction of Varani's IV under Concord Resolution 7, the right of a member civilization to protect its people and demonstrate its capacity for defense." The Threni delegate, 3 seats left. One of the louder voices in the room leaned forward. "Resolution 7 does not authorize this scale of." "Resolution 7 does not cap it either." Voss picked up her tea. "I'd recommend everyone take the time to read the original text. It's quite short." She let the room handle that. The Tyrath observer in the gallery had her recorder running. She had been running it continuously for 3 days. Her notes from this session were already longer than any notes she had taken in 60 years of Concord observation. She wrote, "Voss controls the room without raising her voice. She does this by saying what is true. In a chamber of this size, truth functions as a weapon because so few people here are accustomed to it." She underlined it. Then, after a moment, crossed out the word *weapon and wrote *anchor*. In the Vreth High Command Chamber, Consul Draveth stood at a window that looked out over the Capitol and asked his senior military staff the question he already knew the answer to. "If we engage," he said, "how long?" His senior admiral, a decorated man, undefeated in 6 previous engagements, the kind of soldier who had built a life on understanding odds, did not answer immediately. He looked at his own hands on the table. He looked at the tactical display where the human fleet's outer edge was just becoming visible to long-range Vreth sensors. Not all of it, just the front, just the beginning, like seeing the first edge of a wave that came from somewhere too far away to find the source. He picked up his stylus. "Set it down." "I'm not going to answer that question," he said. Draveth looked at him. "Because the answer," the admiral said, carefully, like a man choosing which words to stand behind, "would not help you, and it would not change what we need to do next." The room was quiet. Through the window the Capitol went about its business. Shops open, people moving. Children, probably somewhere below, doing the things children do in the morning. 9 billion people. None of them had voted on Varani's IV. None of them had been in the Commerce Authority meeting where someone had looked at a mineral survey and decided that 4.2 million settlers were a problem to be solved rather than a population to be respected. None of them had signed the order. They would not be the ones who paid for it. That was the thing. The human fleet was out there and it was vast, and it hadn't fired yet. And the not firing was the loudest thing Draveth had ever heard. "Get me a communication line to Ambassador Voss," he said. His aide looked uncertain. "Direct contact would be." "Get me the line," Draveth said. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has stopped pretending he has options. The line opened. The fleet moved. And in the cold dark between Vreth space and human space, 70,000 ships sailed on with the patience of a civilization that had built them one by one over 31 years and had been in no hurry at all. The Vreth home fleet assembled in 3 hours. 3,112 ships. Every warship in the home system, every defense platform pulled back from its station, every reserve vessel that still had fuel in its drives. Grand Admiral Vex stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the formation take shape on his tactical display. Clean lines, solid coverage. the best defensive arrangement his strategists had designed over 40 years of wargaming this exact scenario. He had wargamed a lot of scenarios. He had not wargamed this one closely enough. The human fleet arrived. It didn't arrive the way fleets arrive in tactical simulations, in a surge, in a charge, weapons hot and targeting systems screaming. It arrived the way weather arrives, the way a tide arrives. Gradually and then all at once, and then it was simply there, filling the long-range display from one edge to the other, and then past both edges. And the junior officers on Vex Bridge were making sounds that were not quite words, because words required a frame of reference, and the frame of reference had just stopped working. 70,000 ships. They stopped. That was the part that did something strange to the human mind, and presumably Vec thought to whatever the Vreth equivalent of that was. They didn't fire. They didn't sweep past in an attack arc, didn't maneuver for position, didn't send targeting pings. They arranged themselves in a geometric formation, so precise it looked designed by mathematics rather than commanded by individual captains. And then they stopped, sitting in the black between his fleet and Vreth Prime like a wall made of light and metal and 31 years of patience. His tactical officer spoke without being asked to. "They're not attacking." Vec looked at the display for a long time. "No," he said. "What are they?" "Waiting," Vec said. The bridge was quiet. 3,000 ships on his side, 70,000 on theirs. Every gun on every one of his vessels was charged and ready, and the only thing that firing would accomplish was giving the 70,000 a reason to do something they were currently choosing not to do. He was an admiral. He understood the difference between a battle and a statement. He opened a channel to Vreth High Command. "Tell the Council," he said, "that the humans have arrived." A pause and the engagement status. He looked at the wall of light. "There is no engagement," he said. "That is the status." Ambassador Voss sent the terms from a folding chair. That was the thing nobody in the subsequent historical record quite knew how to handle. Not the terms themselves, not the fleet outside, but the image from the *Aurum Vigil *S internal camera. Sierra Voss in a folding chair in the ship's communications bay, in her jacket, no diplomatic staging, no formal backdrop, a half-finished cup of tea on the console beside her, sending the most consequential diplomatic transmission in 30 years like someone sending a grocery list. She had written the terms herself in her quarters, the night before the fleet reached Vreth orbital space. She had not consulted a legal team. She had not run them through the standard Concord Diplomatic Language Review Board, which existed to smooth rough edges, replace hard words with soft ones, translate asterisk this is what you did asterisk into this is what may have occurred. She had no interest in smooth edges. The terms: full reparations to Varani's IV survivors and diaspora, calculated at the Concord standard rate for wrongful colonial destruction, payable within 2 standard years. Vreth withdrawal from 3 contested border systems, the ones that had been slowly absorbed over the previous decade through what the Vreth Commerce Authority called incremental infrastructure integration, and what everyone else called something else. A formal entry into the Concord historical record, not the diplomatic record, not the legal proceedings archive, but the permanent public history that species could not expunge or amend. The entry to use the word that Consul Draveth had spent 17 pages in that chamber avoiding. Massacre. And the 4th term. A permanent amendment to the Concord founding charter. Any civilization found to have committed deliberate population eradication against a member species would immediately and permanently forfeit Concord protection status. No procedural review, no grace period, no 17 pages of legal framework. The Vreth High Council received the terms in their chamber. Draveth read them once, passed the document to his legal advisor, who read them and passed them back without comment. Dravith opened the channel to Voss. These terms presuppose a guilt that has not been. Consul, her voice was not unkind. That was somehow worse than if it had been. Look out your window. He looked. From the council chamber, high up in the government spire, overlooking the capital, Vreth Prime looked the way it always looked. Cities lit below. The sweep of the northern continent. The ocean, which was silver at this hour. And above the atmosphere, visible now to the naked eye, because the fleet was close enough to be visible. Running lights spread from horizon to horizon like a second sky of stars that hadn't been there yesterday. The window showed it all. If you'd like to discuss the legal framing, Voss said, I'm happy to schedule a session. We can take as long as you need. A pause. What happens if we decline? Dravith asked. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I'll ask the Admiral. The line was still open. The silence on it was the particular silence of a man understanding the shape of the room he was in. Dravith set the document down, looked at his legal advisor, his military liaison, the senior counselors, 8 of them, none of whom had an expression he could read anymore because they were all doing the same thing he was doing, which was looking at the terms and then looking at the window and performing the simple arithmetic of what the fleet's presence meant. How long do we have to review? He asked. You have as long as you need, Voss said. They signed in 6 hours. Akefer found out from a one-line message from Voss on his personal comm. Done. Terms accepted in full. He read it, forwarded it to Nuz, put the comm in his pocket. Then he walked to the secondary observation bay on the *Orem Vigil *S port side, the one that wasn't staffed, the one with the wide viewport that looked out at a slight angle toward Vreth Prime itself. He stood at the viewport for a while. The planet was blue-green from here, wrapped in white cloud, cities showing as light on the dark side. Ordinary. The kind of world that looked like a world and nothing more. 9 billion people going about whatever 9 billion people went about on a morning that was, for most of them, just a morning with a strange amount of military traffic in the sky. 9 billion people who had not made the decision that killed Varani's IV. The decision had been made by a committee, maybe 30 people, maybe fewer, maybe one man with a Commerce Authority seal and an eye on a mineral survey. 9 billion people. Every one of them had a name. He said it quietly, to the viewport, to Vreth Prime, to himself. He said it the way you say a thing you need to hear out loud so you don't forget it in the days ahead, when the story got clean and processed and filed away, when Varani's IV became a diplomatic precedent instead of 412 pages. He stood there until Nuz found him. Terms confirmed, she said. Council signed all 4 conditions. I know. She stood beside him. They looked at the planet together. The word, he asked, he meant the 4th term, the one that mattered. In the draft, her voice was even. She had been keeping her voice even for days. They tried to negotiate it down to civilian casualty event. Voss said no. They came back with population loss incident. A pause. Voss said no again. And massacre *, Nuz said, as written in the permanent record. He breathed out. Good. He stayed another minute. Then he turned from the viewport, walked back to the bridge, stood at the main console, and gave the stand-down order in a voice that the entire bridge could hear. The fleet began its turn. 70,247 ships, slow and enormous, turning in the dark away from Vreth Prime and pointing themselves toward home. Not in retreat, not in defeat, but in the particular motion of something that has done what it came to do and no longer needs to be here. The last thing visible from Hesk Station, 11 hours later, was the running lights fading, one by one first, then in clusters, then the clusters thinning until the stars came back, the real ones, the permanent ones, and the horizon was ordinary again. Magistrate Torin watched from the same window he had stood at when they arrived. His deputy stood behind him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Torin said, "Send a report to command." "What do I say?" He thought about it. "Say they came, they stopped, they left." He paused. "Say they didn't fire once." His deputy typed it up. In the conquered chamber in the gallery, the Tyreth observer looked at the entry she had just written in her notes, read it back, and then added one line below it. "They built enough to end a civilization. They chose not to. I have been trying to decide if that is mercy or warning. I think it is both. I think they know it is both. New Varanis didn't look like much yet." That was the honest truth of it, and the people who had chosen to come here, who had looked at the survey images, the red dust and the prefab housing grids and the two suns hanging in a sky that was almost the right color, had known it wouldn't look like much. Not yet. They had come anyway. They had come because the two suns were right. Because the survey team had found a system with two suns specifically, had spent 6 months looking for one. Because the people who survived Varani's IV had been born under two suns, and the team had understood, without being asked to understand, that you don't put people back somewhere that feels wrong. It wasn't Varani's IV. It would never be Varani's IV. But the light was familiar. Ambassador Sira Voss arrived on a transport with no diplomatic attachés, no security detail, no official designation. She had filed the leave request herself, marked it personal, and gotten on a ship that smelled like recycled air and someone's instant noodles, and sat in an economy seat for 9 hours because all the better seats were taken by families carrying boxes and rolled-up rugs, and in one case, a very old bicycle that someone had decided was worth the weight allowance. She helped carry prefab wall sections from a supply depot on her second morning there. A man named Caro, big, quiet, third-generation Varani's IV, who had been off-world on a freight run when it happened and had never quite stopped looking like he was still processing the fact of having survived, showed her how to fit the connectors. She got it wrong 3 times. He didn't make her feel bad about it. She got it right on the 4th. By afternoon, a building had a wall that hadn't existed at breakfast. She went back to help the next day, and the day after that. Nobody asked her who she was. Some people knew. They didn't bring it up, which was a kindness she didn't know how to receive and accepted anyway. The memorial had been installed on the 14th day after first settlement. It wasn't large. The colony didn't have resources for large yet, and besides, the people who had planned it had decided that large was not the right shape for what they were trying to do. What they built was a stone pillar, rough-surfaced, just over 2 meters tall, planted in the red dust in the center of what would eventually become the main settlement square. On every surface, laser-etched in letters small enough that you had to get close to read them. Every name. All of them. Every one of the 4.2 million people who had been on Varani's IV when it ended. In no particular order, not alphabetical, not by district or family unit or any organizational logic. Just names, one after another, because they had not ended in any order either, and it seemed wrong to impose a structure on them now. To read a name, you had to lean in. You had to get close enough that the stone was a few inches from your face, close enough to feel the slight warmth it held from the two suns, close enough that one name at a time was all you could see. That part had been intentional. Voss stood in front of it on her 4th afternoon in New Varanis. People moved around her. Someone was cooking something in a building 2 streets over, something with spices, something warm, and the smell moved through the dust and mixed with the dry, mineral scent of the new planet. A child ran past her with a toy that beeped, chased by a slightly older child who wanted the toy. Somewhere behind her, 2 people were having a completely ordinary argument about whether a load-bearing strut had been installed correctly. Life had that quality. It kept going. It didn't wait for you to finish your grief before it started being life again. She stood in front of the pillar and read. She couldn't read all of them, she knew that. There was no version of the afternoon that contained all 4.2 million names, not even standing here until it was dark, not even standing here until the red dust was damp with the night cooling, and the two suns had both set and left the stars to handle things. She couldn't read all of them. She started reading anyway. She moved around the pillar slowly, letting the names come to her one at a time. Some of them she had to brush dust from with her thumb to read clearly. Children's names appeared sometimes, smaller letters because there was so much to fit, and those she read more slowly without meaning to, her thumb tracing the shapes on the stone. She was out there for a long time. When she finished, not finished, when she had done what she could do, she reached into her jacket. The manifest was soft at the folds now. 4 months of being carried against a heartbeat had done that to it, made it feel less like paper and more like something that had been handled until it understood what it was for. The first fold had worn through almost completely, had to be opened carefully. She unfolded it, all 412 pages, unfolding in sections, the whole weight of it in her hands. She smoothed the first page against the stone of the pillar. The same names. The same list, the same numbers, the same format, just printed on paper instead of etched in stone. She stood there until she had read every page, turning them against the stone, smoothing each one flat before she moved to the next. When she finished, she folded the manifest back up. She did not put it back in her jacket pocket. She set it at the base of the pillar, flat on the ground in the red dust, between two small stones someone had placed there, offerings, or anchors, or both. She straightened up, stood for another moment, walked back to the settlement. On Earth, in the Office of Strategic Command, a junior analyst named Bren knocked on Admiral Akafer's door with a scheduling question, fleet maintenance rotation, nothing dramatic, the kind of logistics that didn't stop for history. Akafer was at his desk. The east wall of his office, the one that looked like a wall, was closed. The panel showed no light. Bren handled his scheduling question, was about to leave, then stopped because he was young and new and the historical record had just been updated with the full public accounting of the Vreth engagement, and he had been reading it, and there was something he needed to ask. "Sir," he said, "the panel." Akafer looked at him. "The authorization queue," Bren said. "The counter, is it, will it be?" He didn't quite know how to end the sentence. Akafer considered him for a moment, not unkindly. "I hope not," he said. Bren nodded, started to turn. "But it stays charged," Akafer said. "Not as a threat, not as a boast, as a simple fact about the shape of the universe, the way a man might note that winter comes or that debts accumulate, or that the things you build to protect the people you love have to stay ready, because the people you love don't stop needing protection just because you ask them to." Bren nodded again, left. The office was quiet. Akafer reached into his desk, took out a single printed photograph, Varani's IV, taken from orbit from an old survey satellite before. Green-brown, cloud-covered, ordinary. The kind of world that looked like a world where people lived. He put it back in the drawer. 6 months later, the Galactic Concord held its first full session under the new charter. 15 species at the table. The Vreth held a monitoring seat, no vote, restricted presence, the quiet punishment of a civilization that had to sit in the room and be watched for a while before anyone trusted them with anything. The new amendment to the founding charter was read into the permanent record by the moderator in the flat, careful language of official proceedings. But the words underneath the language were not flat, not careful, were in fact the sharpest words that had been formally adopted in the Concord's 400-year history. A young attaché from a species that had joined the Concord only 12 years ago, still learning the rhythms, still figuring out what mattered, leaned over to his supervisor during the procedural portion of the session and asked in a low voice about the human delegation. He had been reading the historical record. He had questions. "They have 70,000 warships," he said. "Why do they only have one seat?" His supervisor looked at the human seat, where Ambassador Voss was arranging her datapad with the unhurried ease of someone who had been in this room many times and expected to be in it many more. "Because they only asked for one," the supervisor said. The attaché thought about this. Could they ask for more? His supervisor watched Voss for a moment. She had just nodded at the Vreth monitoring delegate across the room, polite, neutral, no warmth and no malice, the nod of someone who had what she needed and didn't need to perform anything further. The Vreth delegate nodded back. "That," the supervisor said, "is exactly why no one wants to find out." The session continued. The amended charter held. The names in the permanent record stayed exactly as written. No diplomatic softening, no legal revision, no 17 pages explaining why another word might be more accurate. Massacre. In the stone pillar on New Voronezh, the name stayed too. Laser-etched, permanent, resistant to dust and wind, and the long, patient work of red soil becoming something livable. 14 months after first settlement, the main square had taken shape around the pillar, a water point to the left, a supply exchange to the right, children cutting through on the way to the learning annex that had opened 3 weeks ago. The pillar stood in the middle of all of it. Kara walked past it every morning on the way to the construction yard. He didn't stop. He didn't have a ritual for it, no pause, no gesture. But every morning his eyes moved to the stone for a moment, just a moment. The way your eyes find something familiar when you pass it often enough that the looking becomes part of how you know where you are. At the base of the pillar, the folded paper had weathered into the stone over months of dust and dew and the slow work of time. You couldn't take it up cleanly anymore. It had become part of the ground there. Part of the place. Part of the answer to the question of what a civilization remembers, and how, and whether it carries the weight of its dead like a burden or like a compass that points toward the only direction that makes any sense. Forward. Always forward. Into the unfamiliar light of two suns on a world that was not the old world, and would never be, and was becoming slowly, with red dust in every crease of every jacket, with walls that had been fitted wrong and corrected, with the smell of someone's cooking drifting over everything, something new. 40 years later, the Tyreth archivist who had sat in the Concord gallery with her recorder running, added a final entry to the account she had been building since the day Voss walked out of the chamber. She read it aloud at her institution's annual record-keeping ceremony, in the careful, measured voice of someone who understood that some sentences need to be said slowly. Voronezh IV was not the first colony humanity lost. She paused. It was the last.